Good morning, Amnon. How are you? It's such a pleasure to meet with you. Almost 15 years ago, we nearly started working together on history and the Bible. You have history, I have the Bible. Many beautiful things grow when history and the Bible come together. And you are tireless, and you called on me to join the new Bnei Noah project, which is an amazing thing. Because the Bible is a book that the whole world loves, the whole world learns from it. And every connection between history and the Bible, every connection with the Bible, which is not just a religious book, but a book that contains deep insights about history, is something the whole world can engage with. So it's really enjoyable to talk with you in Jerusalem on a Friday while you're in Samaria, which is flourishing and thriving. We're actually speaking within prophecies. I'm within the prophecy of old men and women who will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, and you are within the prophecy of vineyards who will once again be planted on the hills of Samaria. It's such a joy to broadcast to the whole world from within prophecy. Who would have believed that we would met at this? So I wanted to talk to you today about history and the Bible in a current context. Today, the world is a very, very global place. We are part of global processes. And I wanted us to talk about that, whether it's connected to the Bible, whether it's not connected to the Bible, and what can be done with it. What do you think?
Let me ask you a question. Maybe that's how this question will move forward. The world is changing before our eyes. This is most evident in the Middle East, Syria, for example. Hezbollah is growing, Russia, Ukraine, and more. Suddenly, new players are also getting involved, the Houthis from Yemen. And where is Israel headed? With all these forces moving around the world. And the opening question is whether we can draw conclusions from the Bible about these kinds of processes that are happening.
It seems that the Bible doesn't say Threads, it doesn't say Trump, and it doesn't say Netanyahu. But in the Bible, you have an amazing toolbox. The Bible is like someone giving you a glimpse into the workspace of the world's manager. He shows you projects, what we would call today the creator's past projects. And the Bible is full of projects that this creator, the Holy One, blessed be he, has done in the world. And to the prophets, he revealed his system of considerations, his working mechanism. If I wanted to go for a job interview with someone and wanted to understand what they're going to do tomorrow, what I would do is look at the previous projects they've done. And he revealed to us his systems of considerations. That would give me some input, some tools to work with about how he works, what he thinks. It is written in the book of Amos. For the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. This verse in the book of Amos is specifically talking about global events happening in his time. Assyria is expanding into the Middle East, and Amos tells the people, you are looking for the interpretation of your events in the wrong places, in geopolitical and economic arenas. But in fact, the deeper interpretation of these events is found in prophecy. Because the one who truly manages these events is the Holy One, blessed be he.
And prophecy, that's amazing what you're saying. So it means that you are able to learn from the Bible and get explanations for where all these processes originate. If I understand correctly what you said. If it's written in the Bible, you can approach the Bible as a written book, draw from it those mechanisms from which you can derive conclusions and better understand what happens in the world at times.
Yes, but I want to emphasize, in my opinion, it's a toolbox. It's not a one-to-one correspondence.
And you see, sometimes maybe you can explain what a toolbox is.
A toolbox means that if I saw that the Assyrian project, God managed with certain considerations, and the Persian project, he managed with other considerations, and the project of the 4 and 5 kings, the story of Lech Lecha, he managed with yet other considerations. So I become acquainted with the system of considerations that God presents to us in the management of the world.
After all, if a person wants, so in order to understand, sorry for interrupting Tree, to guide them through project by project so we can understand exactly what this is about and how it's done.
All right, I'm just finishing the point that if I want to know, Trump is a very, very unpredictable person. People really want to know what he's planning. So what do? They look into his entire history. He's an older man. He's done many things in his life. What are the systems, the considerations? And then every time you read in the newspaper, this commentator says that Trump is impulsive, that he's like this and like that. Though, does he know that? Because he saw it from past projects. So if we look through the lens that the wisdom of Kabbalah opens up for us regarding global world events, we can examine and see some principles, and we'll have a sort of training ground. And truly, I feel that when the current process began, when Trump came to power a few months ago, so we studied chapters from the Bible here, and some of the things, the processes were pretty transparent from the start, what happened, what was going to happen. So let's get into some examples. The Bible is first and foremost a very, very global book. It's true that the Bible is a book with the people of Israel at its center, but actually, almost never, maybe never are the Israelites a process that stands alone. And this is a common mistake among many lovers of Israel. They think that because Israel is at the center of the Bible, if a process is divine, it must specifically relate to Israel. The exact opposite is true. The book of Genesis is a book that is entirely filled with global processes. Even before there is Abraham, our forefather, before there is a people of Israel at all, there are global processes whose principle is very simple. This is obvious. I don't think I'm saying anything new here. The Bible teaches us that history is managed by a force that desires good in the world and ultimately removes the evil and brings the good. This is not something to be taken for granted. Humanity, for example, experienced a great crisis called the flood. And the flood is something that the whole world experienced, and the whole world refers to it. And when you dig in the area of Syria, what used to be Syria, you find ancient writings that describe the flood. So how did humanity interpret the flood? And this is amazing. People interpreted the flood as a quarrel between gods, or as gods who were disturbed by humanity. And so they poured water so that it wouldn't make noise. Like when you have a neighbor who makes noise at noon, you find a way to pour water to quiet things down. What is at the root of this interpretation? At the root of this interpretation lies the perception that the world is managed by dark forces more powerful than us. It's an amazing thing. In the ancient pagan system, the gods would take women from one another. In other words, the forces that govern the world are themselves very primal, very evil forces. They take women from each other. This immediately dictates how humanity behaves. What happens? If your gods take women from one another, then so do you. If the strong take the women of the weak, and the sons of God awakened and the daughters of man, and they took for themselves wives from whomever they chose. In other words, if the world is run, and anyone familiar with the mythological pagan systems, the Canaanite, Ugaritic, Greek, Egyptian, they're all the same. The world is run by a system of violent dark forces. You have to get along with them. Obviously, a humanity that grows up with such a worldview will continue to conduct itself according to that same worldview. And then, if there is a flood, you might interpret it as such. Yes, it's part of a quarrel among the gods, each one wanting to take something from someone weaker than himself. Then the Bible comes and tells us the opposite. The flood comes as a response to this. The sons of God saw the daughters of man, and then the Holy One, blessed be he, becomes angry. And then there is a flood. That is to say, even a natural disaster, as global and all-encompassing as the flood is, in the end, part of a divine movement whose mechanism is directed toward a better world. That's the basic premise.
Now, if I remember correctly, when the land was filled with violence, there are other phenomena, whether mentioned in the scriptures or not, that anger the Holy One, blessed be he. And then the flood comes upon the earth.
Which is the same thing.
It's not just the conflict between the gods, but it's actually unfolding and taking place right now, in this very moment.
That's exactly what I'm saying. The Jewish perspective teaches the world something, a mechanism that's completely the opposite. That is, if you have a pagan perception, then even when a global disaster happens, you associate it with your violent perception. But the Torah comes and teaches the opposite. The whole point is to remove the world from violence, to save the world from the greatest form of violence, which is the sons of God taking the daughters of man. Now, you and I both know that humanity hasn't learned its lesson. Until the people of Israel came along, humanity did not learn its lesson. The fact that we find writings, for example, about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describe the flood as a violent event and not as a moral one, shows that the nations who interpreted the flood this way continue to behave violently. And this is also something that is written in the Bible. We know this. When Abraham wanders around the Middle East after the flood, not many years after the flood, he knows that everywhere the big boss, the local king, can take his wife for himself. This is a custom that the Greeks also continued many, many years after the flood. That is to say, the Bible actually goes around and presents a different perspective. If we want to sum up in a few words what Abraham did on a global scale, then after thousands of years of history, King David wants to summarize what Abraham accomplished on a global level. He says, and they wandered from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people. He did not allow anyone to oppress them, and he rebuked kings on their behalf, saying, do not touch my anointed ones, and do not harm my prophets. In other words, what is Judaism? First stage of Judaism? It goes around the world. Abraham, our forefather, moving from place to place, and tells the kings, stop, you do not take another man's wife. This is essentially the first struggle over the interpretation of a global event. Abraham, our forefather, goes from place to place and says, there is a God in the world, and he brought a flood because you took other men's wives, or if anyone takes wives, please do not do this. If you do this, you will be taught a lesson. Pharaoh was taught a lesson. Avimelech was taught a lesson. Truly, the very first thing Abraham calls out in the name of God. But sometimes we perceive Abraham as calling out in the name of God like to make a distinction, like a priest calling out in a church. No, Abraham, our forefather, teaches people how to look at their own history. That is how you call out in the name of God. And this is also the importance of our conversation. To call out in the name of God is not to call out in a synagogue, to call out in our house of prayer. To call out in the name of God is to interpret history in the name of God. And Abraham, our forefather, and here we come to a global event that takes place in the days of Abraham, a world war. The pre-first World War, the War of the Four Angels and the Five. Now here, in order to understand the interpretation of this war, we need to look at two places in the Bible. The first place is in the portion of Lech Lecha in the book of Genesis. And the second place is in the book of Deuteronomy, 400 years later. And there we see that the Torah actually tells us that in the Middle East, in the area of the land of Israel, there was a corrupt and depraved culture. There were all kinds of nations that were corrupt. They were called by derogatory names: the Emim, the Zamzumim, the Rephaim, the people of Peri. There are all kinds of ancient writings called the Cave Scrolls. In the ancient world, nations would curse all these wild peoples because they truly were wild peoples. And the first World War of the Four Kings against the Five cleared the Middle East of these cultures and made way for civilized cultures. God removed from here all the evil nations, and in their place, through a long process of 4 generations, brings in nations that he desires among them, to whom he gives a chance: the Ammonites, the Moabites, who are descendants of Lot, Ser and Edom, who are descendants of Esau, and the New Philistines. In the book of Deuteronomy, it is written that in the coastal plain, there lived a people called the Abim. The fathers were with a cow. They came with more than a torbet from Cyprus, button satisfying a button, and they removed them. This is a people who know how to make treaties with Abraham, our forefather.
The second thing, what I want to present to you is that Abraham made Isaac his legitimate heir in the land, and the sons of his concubines he sent to the east. And according to my research, I have substantiated that to the east means he sent them to China and India. In fact, in India, there is a caste called Abrahamics. Abrahamic is a team of Abraham. And they are actually at the lowest rank there in terms of their status. And it's the same in China. That is Abraham's attempt to spread the calling to spread Judaism was not limited only to the land of Israel, but he sent them to countries with millions of people where they were supposed to have an influence on those lands.
Yes, and even if we don't go that far, even if we say that he only sent them to more eastern regions, still within the Middle East, that's already a huge expansion. And the Torah calls Abraham the father of many nations. So the Torah, in the book of Genesis and Deuteronomy, describes empires fighting over their interests. The Torah writes that the reason the 4 kings came here was some story of rebellion between the 5 kings and the 4 kings. The Torah doesn't hide this. This is very important. The Torah does not ignore material considerations that all historians are able to recognize. It indicates that within this, there is a much deeper mechanism at work. And this mechanism is a process that in that generation, no one saw. In that generation, they did see something. They saw how Abraham saved Lot. It really is a remarkable, formative story, one of responsibility. We live in a world of hostages, a world of rescuing hostages, and a world in which hostages must be saved by decisively striking at the forces of evil. All of this is written in the portion of Lech Lecha, but in the midst of things, you suddenly see a much broader picture. The Middle East is filling up with nations who believe they have a chance, and the Holy One, blessed be He, says, I am settling nations here, do not touch them. Do not touch the Edomites, do not touch the Moabites or the Ammonites, because these are nations whose cultures I am building upon, which perhaps might develop into something positive. We'll see if that actually happens, right?
And for you, Rabbi, let's go back for a moment to the story of the captivity and the hostages to really see what we can learn from this portion. Because I'm not sure everyone is familiar with all the details. I want to see the level of explain specifically what happened there and what we can learn from it regarding our children and the issue of rescuing the captive.
And we'll elaborate on that in a moment, and then we'll see something amazing. The great global processes begin with small moral choices. And let's talk for a moment about Lot. Lot goes with Abraham, our forefather. He is Abraham's nephew, and he goes with Abraham, but they actually don't get along that well. And they walk together, and then at some point they decide to part ways. Abraham, being a gentleman, tells Lot, choose where you want to be. And Lot chooses to go to the region of Sodom, because it's an area with many springs. Everything is well watered. And then this area ends up caught in a world war between the 4 kings, who apparently come from the region of Mesopotamia, and the 5 local kings who are apparently under Egyptian influence. In the course of this, they take all of Sodom captive, as well as Abraham and also Lot. Abraham, who is a minor player in simple terms, he has 300 soldiers, 318 soldiers, according to the sages, even fewer with a very small group, about the size of a small battalion, chases after the kings at night, surprises them. The element of surprise is extremely central in wars in the Bible and frees Lot. Abraham, our forefather, takes a grave risk in order to save Lot and also his neighbors, the people who are taken captive by a violent group. This event is a formative one. That is, when we talk about a historical process, just a second historical process of a new Middle East filled with better days, this historical process, which takes 400 years to unfold, begins with a single moment of choice by our forefather Abraham to take responsibility for his captives. How can this be understood? How can this be understood? 315 soldiers against 4 angels. How does he manage to get in there, return to the angels' camp, and remove the halos from there? How can this be explained? Look, the Bible is a book full of such stories. Gideon, too, with 300 men, wipes out a very large camp of Midianites. The Bible, it's clear that when it comes to such an event, there is divine assistance, help from heaven. But the help from heaven rests on our own great courage and on cleverness. That is, having the courage to come with such a small group and the cleverness to surprise them at night and so on. That's how it was with Abraham, our forefather. That's how it was with Joshua bin Nun. And Joshua came upon them suddenly. All night he went up from Gilgal. That's how it was with Gideon, and that's how it was with the Maccabees. This is a model. There really is a legend. There really is a legend about Rabbi Becharut with his brother Mishlam Zo, who was sent to Rome with gold and youths to give the gift it's worth knowing this story. Yes, let's tell it for a moment, but it's a very complex event. The sages, I think they have parables in our legends.
First, the legend tells the story, and then I'll offer some philosophical interpretation of this legend. There's a verse in the book of Isaiah that says, "Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his servants? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, window and chaff with his bow."
We'll return later to this verse and its original meaning. The sages, regarding this verse, told a story. For Abraham, our father, there was a special ash. So he would throw the ash at the angels, and it would turn into swords and arrows. And then the story goes that there was a very righteous Jew who, whatever happened to him, would always say, "This too is for the best. This too is for the best." One day, they sent him to the Roman Empire to give them precious stones and jewels. And on the way, the precious stones were stolen from him. He stayed overnight at some inn, and they stole the precious stones and filled the bag with ash instead. He arrives at the king, and it's very dangerous to come before the king with a chest full of ash. The king could get very angry. In fact, he was very angry and wanted to kill Menachem. Then Elijah the prophet appeared, disguised as a minister, and said to the king, "What is this? This is the ash of Abraham, our forefather. When you throw it at the enemies, it turns into swords." And Menachem, throughout this whole ordeal, is unfazed. Whatever happens to him, he says, "This too is for the best." And indeed, they throw the ash, and it turns into swords. And afterwards, the innkeeper said, "Wow, we have such special ash in our inn. Let's bring our ash to the king." They brought the ash, threw it at the enemies, but nothing happened, and they were killed. That's the story of Chazak. I think this story is a parable. That is, I think the ash of Abraham, our forefather, what is ash? Ash is our reality, something that exists everywhere like sand. You encounter it everywhere, our material reality. The sages came to say that when Menachem stands, looks everywhere and says, "This too is for the best," it turns the ash into swords. In other words, reality itself becomes part of the divine purpose. And what we just spoke about regarding Abraham, our father, is turning ash into swords. In other words, there is a world war which actually has nothing to do with Abraham, our father. Such wars happen all the time, every day. Wars between nations over interests. And the awareness of this too is for the best, meaning that even this is managed by the Holy One, blessed be He, turns this ash into sword. This really essentially conveys the great importance of what we are doing right now, what you and I, Amnon, are doing right now, turning ashes into swords. We are looking at historical, global, straightforward processes, truly seeing the hand of God, and in that itself, it truly becomes a divine event. The interesting thing is that this verse in Isaiah originally was said about a different global phenomenon, the expansion of Assyria into the land of Israel. And Isaiah the prophet says, "Look who did this." That is the meaning of the verse. Who gave his sword as dust, his bow as driven stubble. In other words, in my opinion, the sages in this story are giving us a key and telling us, when you see the hand of God within the story, you truly turn the story into part of the divine trend. If we go back to Abraham, our forefather, we see something very interesting. Abraham turns the event of this world war into a formative event in a historical process spanning 400 years, during which the entire Middle East was filled with sympathetic nations, with moral nations, with nations from whom we have moral expectations. God will give them 800 years of opportunity for moral growth together. And that is the divine plan until the spread of the ox. There would be several countries in the Middle East, 8 countries, all civilized, all descendants of Abraham, our forefather. They would develop joint methods of action, and his method would reach its peak in the days of Solomon, and they would fill the world with the knowledge of God. This event is suspected to be the end.
I think as we approach the end of our half hour, the rabbi will summarize exactly what we've seen and where things are headed in the next episode.
What we've discussed is that the Bible is full of global, worldwide events whose external side is full of interests and wars, and the Bible reveals within them divine trends. And since the Bible is a book that deals a great deal with such events, we have the opportunity to peek into the workshop of the Creator of the world as he reveals it to the prophets, to see the considerations, the systems of consideration, and to learn about them. What is the toolbox? This study can also teach us about processes that we are witnessing today. Again, each process has its own uniqueness, each process its own purpose. But when you know the Creator and his toolbox, it opens our eyes to much broader and ever-changing processes. We have a lot to learn from this. We specifically learned about the first process, the real World War I, the war of the 4 kings against the 5. And this war, we saw 2 things. First, that the war appears from the outside to be about external interests. But in reality, it was the beginning of a 400-year process of settling the Middle East with better nations, replacing the wild peoples who were there. And the second thing is that the driving force behind the process is Abraham, our forefather's decision to conduct himself in this event with a super moral and profoundly deep sense of responsibility for the captives. Our small choices as descendants of Abraham, our forefather, in how we deal with captives are a very significant part of the question of where the entire global process will go. Later on, we will see more processes and more meanings, as well as our role as interpreters of these processes, and also how we can give meaning to these processes in a creative way. Look closely, give meaning to the process, and truly, the process will become one of divine significance. It's a pleasure talking with you. There was a sense of formality in the discussion. We are already looking forward to the next program to hear the additional details show the Creator of the material works and how faith shapes us. This understanding can also strengthen us in the difficult reality we are experiencing. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.